Our final speaker is Ken McLean. And I have to tell you that a year ago, when Emily and I were discussing which speakers we would have in which order, she said, save Ken McLean for last because he is the nicest person in the world. Now, I thought she was married to the nicest person in the world, so I said, I really want to meet this guy. Kenneth McLean, W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Literature and Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellow at Cornell University, knew A.R. Ammons in three ways: as student, colleague, and friend. He wrote about Ammons as a teacher in an essay he called A Love Note, recalling Ammons' approach in 1970 as non-hierarchical, one of those rare writing classes in which the teacher understood the anxieties of the student and was made gentle by such personal knowledge. McLean writes, Ammons had not been taught to write in a writing program. He, in truth, had little respect for them. What he affirmed was that for him, you were sacred in all of your dilapidation. Self-described as a black student from Harlem who missed the city and was struggling to live through the Vietnam War and the deaths of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, McLean found a displaced friend in Ammons, himself living away from his native heath, rural North Carolina. Later, as McLean began to publish poems, Ammons modeled for Ken the role of poet as practicing the highest calling. Their friendship was not lofty, but playful, and the hours spent in the famous campus coffee shop, the Temple of Zeus, forerunner to our Starbucks, sustained each of them almost to the end of Archie's life. After publishing 8 books of poems, with the death of his brother and his need to say in prose what he felt he could not say in poetry, Ken McLean turned to essays, but he writes what he describes as poetic essays. His essays and his poems share a subject that threads its way through Ammons' work, focusing on the dispossessed, the lost. In an award-winning best essay, A Death in the Family, about his brother, and more recently in Color, Essays on Race, Family, and History, McLean, who takes his parents as his subject, has used his own history as a lens through which to see the American experience. How the son of a Harlem doctor and the son of a North Carolina farmer became friends makes one believe more heartily in the powers of the university campus to bring people together. At Cornell, Ken McLean has directed the Creative Writing Program, has won prestigious teaching awards, and has been a mainstay of committees to choose new university presidents. He is a best-loved Cornellian, and his ties to Cornell, which go back to his undergraduate and graduate years, are lasting. There is no one who talks about Archie Ammons with greater discernment and affection. Returning to Wake Forest for his second visit, Kenneth McLean lives the life we believe in, pro humanitate. Welcome to Archie's home country, Professor McLean.
Now, let me just say, it is a wonderful feeling to be here, and it's just great to be amongst friends. And I want to thank everyone for being so kind to me. Okay, one thing, I'm going to use the word tradition in this. Whenever I use the word tradition, that's with a capital T, which means from Beowulf to Ammons. Okay? The other thing that I will mention 2 people in this talk. I don't use their names to protect the guilty. Beyond that, I think we'll be fine. I said, I will find what is lowly and put my roots of my identity down there. Each day I will wake up and find the lowly nearby, a handy focus and reminder, a ready measure of my insignificance, the voice by which I would be heard, the wills, the kinds of selfishness I could freely adopt as my own. But though I have looked elsewhere, I can find nothing to give myself up to. Everything is magnificent with existence, in surfeit of glory. Nothing is diminished. Nothing has been diminished for me. And that's, of course, from Archie's brilliant poem, Still. There are many people here who knew Archie Ammons better than I did. Many people here who are intimately connected to Archie, including his wonderful wife, Phyllis, John, Vida, the rest of the family. Phyllis, who has been a treasure to me, though I see her rarely, it is as if she is with me always. And of course, Ed and Emily Wilson, great longtime teachers and dear, dear friends of Archie, and Helen Vendler and Roger Gilbert, and many, many other people. I could go, everyone here loves him. Many people here, too, are members of Archie's extended family, lovers of his poetry, and lovers of the man, which that great poetry so well documents. 28 odd books full of irrepressible curiosity and wonder, full of a mind fiercely encountering near everything, and an oeuvre that allows people to have their own private A.R. Ammons, their own favorite connections for reverie, be it in the early, very high romantic inflected books, or the later more discursive ones, often in couplets. Archie's rich provender allows each of us much to own and be owned by. I was lucky to have an especial relationship with A.R. Ammons that lasted from my freshman year at Cornell in 1969 to his death in 2001. I've written about some of this before, so I won't retell it all, but Ammons and I first met when I, as a freshman at Cornell, at the urging of a girlfriend, presented Professor Ammons with a sheaf of what I then thought were poems for his consideration. In all honesty, I didn't know who A.R. Ammons was, nor what a poem was. I was simply someone who wanted to write, who wanted to be corroborated. At the time, I was the intellectually unwashed, and I wasn't interested in anyone providing me soap. But that is not completely true. I had come to Cornell from Harlem because Cornell was trying to deal with race honestly, which meant jumping right into the raw wound. I came to Cornell after black students took over the student union with guns. I chose to come there for that reason. And if I did not know much, I instinctively traveled where my heart told me honesty reigned. Professor Ammons took my poems. I recall how seemingly small-looking he was, folded in on himself in his chair so that he wouldn't seem too imposing. You must also remember he's very, very tall, right? And he told me to return in a week's time in his lovely southern accent, which would make any poem, even the worst drivel, sound magisterial. To show you my level of self-involvement, at no time did I even think that Professor Ammons would not want to read my poems, or that he might not have the time to do so. It did not occur to me that he had legions of young writers asking him at Cornell and elsewhere for his precious consideration. Archie was asked to read poems by literally hundreds of people per year. Often they would send him books and unprinted and unprintable manuscripts with a short note telling him how much they liked his poems, or barring that courtesy, just a blatant request for him to read their work or to help them get published. One man even sent his poems with 10 unaddressed envelopes without stamps, hoping that Archie would find suitable journals to print them. Can you imagine the gall and the nerve? Had this happened merely once or twice, it might have been tolerable. But every day the request came, and though Archie didn't read everything, he tried to. And when he didn't, it worried Archie, like any truly big-hearted people, Even though he tried to be tough-notioned, to keep some distance from the requests, one that might permit him to write and teach, Archie worried that one of those unopened manuscripts might be someone like himself, someone who was a true writer or just a true pariah, someone who might require his attention, who desperately needed an Ed Wilson, a Josephine Miles, or a Phyllis Ammons to honor him. For Archie understood how that small hand he might proffer might be life itself. Yet Ammons had to say no at times, but each request, whether he replied in the affirmative or not, weighed heavily on him. M.H. Abrams, the great Romantic scholar, friend of Archie, and editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, for very understandable reasons, had his secretary send out a form letter to those who sought his attention if he had no previous relationship to them. Archie, however, would respond with a handwritten note. So each denial was painfully corporal to him. He once said to me, "I can't take in the entire world." Actually, in the poems he did. Yet I, too, was little more considerate. Coming as I had with a head full of angers I could barely comprehend, much less articulate, and a sense of African-American dispossession, when I heard Professor Ammons' Southern lilt, I would not return to discuss my poems. In truth, and I'm really sorry for this, and you all can throw stuff at me. In truth, I was not interested in anything a Southerner could tell me. A small, stupid notion I still regret to this day. I should state, in my defense, that I was very enmeshed in the civil rights struggles in those days. Freedom riders lived with my family during the summers, a number of whom had shouldered me cattle prod burns on their genitalia from less than helpful Southern policemen. The physician, Dr. David Spain, who did the Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman autopsy, those 3 students who were murdered in Mississippi in 1963 during Freedom Summer, was my dad's very close friend, and he was at our house 2 days after he examined the murdered threesome. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had stayed with my parents during a rather difficult period in his life, so I do have a great deal of undigested racial ambivalence. I was also, in all honesty, a pretty taciturn kid. In my dorm room, as my wife can testify, I had a few bad pencil drawings on the walls and 1 bare light bulb. Yes, I was a wellspring of fun. And Archie could see a fellow traveler a mile off. But truthfully, my treatment of Professor Ammons initially, and I won't try to mitigate it, was appalling. And I still find my behavior inexcusable. I would apologize to him this day, and I apologize to you. Happily, Professor Ammons did not mention my previous lapse when I appeared in his creative writing class a year later, and I, of course, remained silent. I'm certain he remembered me. I had a huge would-be afro, hard to imagine, and at the time I tried to look as menacing as I could in my 5'8" body. But he, as his wont, had the forbearance and the magnanimity to hold his tongue. And thus began a friendship which would continue through my undergraduate, graduate, and teaching career at Cornell. A friendship that would have delighted Montaigne. I would hope that each of you at some time will have such a friendship, one which is not measured in minutes or hours, but in the absolute knowledge that there is someone who, no matter how thorny your disagreements, is in Joseph Conrad's terms, a secret sharer. Someone, that is, who understands that at your most cantankerous, and disagreeable, you are still sacred. Someone, that is, who will not absolve themselves of you. Let me describe a few other vignettes which argue better for me and tell you more about Archie. It's a weird thing. I have the same problem that everyone's had. You talk about Archie, ARMs. I know I'm supposed to say ARMs, but it's impossible for me to do that. But I find myself going both places. During the creative learning class I took with him in my sophomore year, the one in which he did not mention my previous misanthropy, Archie would hold regular office hours, and I would frequently attend them. I didn't know much about poetry, but I wanted to be a poet. And I sensed that Archie thought I had something, a sliver of potential, beyond my lack of manners. In my first class with him, I wrote 2 poems, one entitled Jazz, which was better than it should have been, since it was merely sound-driven, and it has been reprinted, oddly, a number of times in anthologies. And another, The Poet, which had only one mediocre line, the penultimate one, The Poet, his hand, oh, how it trembles. You see where I was. Which Archie graciously liked. Ammons, as I recalled, seized on the exclamatory, oh, probably because there was nothing else to seize on. Archie, I knew, agreed with the poem's sentiment. Given what he knew and what I might someday learn if I would be willing to be truly vulnerable and present at my life, there would be much trembling indeed. Archie, I should say, had a wonderful way of deducing what was really needed by a younger poet. In many ways, he took your measure early. And Archie tended to be enormously faithful, especially to those of us who, in a fit of pique, became surly and evil. Sadly, if he didn't like you at first, he probably would never cotton to you. And how he made a connection was hard to judge. If you were an outcast, you certainly held his attention, and the more downtrodden you were, the more moon-tossed and vanquished, in his idiom, the more you had hope to enter his good graces. If you were rich, I mean money-wise, it was going to be difficult, unless that somehow made you paradoxically unassuming and underwhelming. A big suit with a tiny body. Then possibly there was hope. And if you were talented, you held, at least potentially, even more keys to the kingdom. I recall one young poet whom Archie championed in an MFA selection committee. His work was wild, bardic, full of enormous verbal improvisation and neologisms. And his humor, though different from Archie's, could have found its way into Archie's later more ribald poems, say, Market Advisor. If you're not in it for the ups and downs, you might as well get out of it, she said. I recall how the rest of the committee was less convinced of the poet's true worth. But Archie very tenderly suggested that this poet was the real thing, and he was. That poet is one of the best young poets of his generation, and though his life has been hard, full of divorce and missteps, he is a true poet, one who suffers, in Ammons' words, that divine unleavening. And someone who has written poems about his daughter, which, in Archie's phrase, know that place where even sorrow stalls. Isn't that lovely? Yet I know of 2 people who never could get into his good graces, and though they were, frankly, a bit fawning, they were not altogether bad people. But Archie saw in them something a bit too superficial, a bit too showy. Interestingly, one of these intellect recently told me something about his life that finally made him real to me. His father, a Protestant priest, had traveled from church to lesser and prominent churches because of his outspoken stance on civil rights in the early 1960s, finally leaving the South. Now, I had known this man for 20 years, and never had any of this come to the fore. Had Archie been acquainted with the young man's inner turmoil, his being tossed about into more and improbable dramas, living here and there like an unwanted vagabond, and the fact that his secret possibly made his life oddly obscurable, possibly then Archie might have found room for him among those he valued. But Archie was right. There were strange twists and turns in this man's life, and he was not honest, since something so weighty should have made its presence known, if not, in fact, in a more credible reticence. And it did seem that his spirit thrust through well after the true devastation. And then, too, I felt, and I can't say why, that this man's story might not be true. I mean, Archie, I think, was right. Most memorably, when I was talking to Professor Ammons that first year in an early meeting, seeing his pot-bound fiscus plant struggling for light, Archie liked to have plants that seemed barely thriving, as if everything, in truth, was hanging in life's petulant and unknowable sustaining. The phone rang. Professor Ammons asked my permission and then answered it. As he listened for a few moments, his face became increasingly wan, and his body seemed more and more overwrought. Although I was caught in my own dilapidation, I was unalterably my mother's son, and so I did possess a modicum of upbringing. Seeing Professor Ammons looking more and more distraught, I quickly stood up and motioned to leave. I wanted to offer him his privacy. Something obviously horrific had taken place. The death of a family member, the loss of a house to fire, and he needed his own comfort. Whatever my involvements, they were secondary. Seeing me motion towards the door, Professor Ammons placed his hand delicately on the receiver and told me to sit back down. As he then explained, the telephone call involved a student who had merely misplaced her umbrella. Might it be in his office, she wondered. That was the sum of it. Suddenly, I realized I was in the presence of someone who had a sense of empathy and deeply concentrated levels of feelings, the likes of which I had never before witnessed. Indeed, his entire biology, like a divining rod, seemed to be altered by that young woman's call and my presence, as if Archie could not navigate the two all-too-real souls thrust upon him, as if his sense of the sanctity of each of us, no matter how large or small our concerns, was too much for him to merely slough off. His entire body, it seemed, had to roil with our consequence, and he could not diminish us, even to the point of his own imminent immobility. It reminded me of a sailboat in irons, the wind neither permitting the boat to yaw left or right. All of a sudden, I could well understand how Ammons could write Nellie Myers, Silver, and Hardweed Path Going. From Hardweed Path Going. Oh, sparkle, when the axe tomorrow falls and the rush is made to open your throat, I will sing, watching dry-eyed as a man, sing my love for you in the tender feedings. She's nothing but a hog, boy. Bleed out, sparkle, the moon-chilled bleaches of your body hanging upside down, hardening through the mind in the night of the first freeze. For Archie, there are no unmonumental hogs or adult women who cannot heal him or us. There is nothing not worthy of singing and acknowledgement. There is nothing, as he reminds us in his lovely poem, still lowly in the universe. There are no partial souls, as he affirms in Nellie Myers, who do not roam his heart. Of course, it's from Nellie Myers. Oh, I will not end my grief when I am gone. I will end visions of her naked feet in the sacred past. I will hear her words, apple candy, which meant Christmas, Lambie's dam, which meant goddamn. And I will not forget how I saw her last, tied in a chair, lest she rise to go and fall. For how innocently indomitable was her lust, and how her legs were turgid and with still blood as she sat, and how her real tears were as I left to go back to college. Damn all colleges. Aware her partial soul, as others thought, roams my love. Mother, not my mother. Grandmother, not my grandmother. Slave to our farm's work, no slave I would not stoop to. I will not end my grief. Earth will not end my grief. I move on, we move on, some scraps of us together. My broken soul leaning towards her to be touched, listening to be healed. Or, of course, from Easter morning, one of the world's great elegies. I stand on the stump of a child, whether myself or my little brother who died, and yell as far as I can't leave this place. For me, it is the dearest and the worst. It is life, nearest to life, which is life lost. It is my place where I must stand and fail, calling attention with tears to the branches not lofting boughs into space, to the barren air that holds the world that was my world. When I was a beginning assistant professor, it was my first year and I was scared, untried, and the youngest member of the creative writing faculty. Baxter Hathaway, the tough, hard-scrabble director and founder of Cornell's distinguished writing program, felt that he could use me to make Ammons discuss changing how we taught creative writing seminars. Baxter wanted to make our workshops more rigorous, to ensure that students knew more about formal verse, learn to write and appreciate a villanelle, for example, be able to explain the difference between a Shakespearean and a Petrarchan sonnet, to comprehend in Baxter's thinking where poems came from, so they might knowingly extend the tradition. Baxter, for those of you who do not know, was a brilliant romanticist and specialist on transformational grammar who had come to Cornell after graduating from the University of Michigan, and he, like Archie, was an outsider. Baxter's parents were not rich, and he was the first person to come to Cornell from outside the Ivy League, and I'm talking about the real Ivy League, some schools, right? Which is crazy. University of Michigan is no small cheese, right? But man, life is getting bizarre. Anyway, that is, he wasn't a member of the club. Those who talked about retaining a young scholar in language such as, well, he's not just top shelf. Indeed, in those curious days, people would dismiss you with no evidence, not one textual surmise. It was murder, as you might imagine, on women and others. And it must have been hellish for both Baxter and Archie, who were clearly brilliant. You didn't get to Cornell any other way. Yet had few people, at least initially, who could truly understand their ambivalent sense of joy at being invited into the great university and their disappointment, understandably, at why it had taken so long. And their sense, too, that they were, no matter how bright, merely tokens. Archie knew how many brilliant people from the South and elsewhere should have been at Cornell, and it rankled. Baxter looked around the table at the gathered creative writing instructors, Walter Slatoff, Jim McConkey, Dan McCall, Edgar Rosenberg, and Allison Laurie. I remember everyone to this moment because I was so scared. I was bottle-tied. And asked me cunningly, Ken, do you think we should spend more time stressing formal concerns, making certain that our students know the tradition before they wander off into free verse? I love that, wander off, right? Before I could say anything, Archie stood up, looked at Baxter and said, "You can't do that, and I won't permit it." It's not a fair question, or more accurately, it's not a fair question as it is posed. Ken shouldn't be put in that position of having to be the first respondent. Let's go around the room in level of seniority. Now listen to this, but even further. Not necessarily that of intelligence. And Archie quickly smiled at me before he again looked furious. I love that man. I mean, it doesn't get any better, right? Archie, of course, knew what Baxter was doing, since the fight Baxter had with Archie with pedagogy was long-standing, albeit a legitimate one. Many students respond well to creative writing classes where the instructor has them experiment with terza rima, write a pantun, or learn how one can alter the metrics of a formal sonnet for some justifiable and hopefully wondrous effect. Many students certainly become better poets through this tutelage, and many just as powerfully do not. Archie, most decidedly, would never argue that a poet is hurt by knowing the rudiments, the tools of her craft. Yet he would suggest, and this is fundamental, that the imposition of this learning come from the poet him or herself. That is, he believed that a poet would discover those things he or she most needed to make the poem successful. That nothing, no formal crutch or formal exercise ultimately would make writing easier, nor should it. It was you, your experience, and the page, and the wonder you had to accommodate, which would hopefully provide your music. Amen. I should state that Archie's desire not to pose anything on a writer came from a profound sense that impositions were deadly, especially to a young poet whose only possibility for true genius came from his or her inability to accept the prevailing poetic convention, which of course was always someone else's way of feeling and knowing. In many ways, whatever one may contend, and this is a difficult argument, good poets have come through mimicry, engaging in extending the tradition. Archie, of course, did much of this. Good poets have come from honoring their irrepressible obsessions, often not being able to find a niche in the prevailing poetics. Archie did this also. Great poets, I would argue, and Archie was certainly that, probably are so committed to their announcements that whether they begin as a formalist or not is secondary to their ultimate enterprise. For whatever else one can say about Archie, his desire to re-engage and extend the tradition of the poem, his absolute productive restlessness to have written some of the most beautiful lyrics which any romantic would find luminous. I think of Singling and Dancing Together. I'm not going to read that whole poem, but that's one of the most beautiful. Can I read the last stanza? Yeah, because darn, man. I mean, this guy, he's too good. He really is. I'm just going to go, but with grace have I to bear in every motion, embracing or turning away, staggering or standing still while you settled kingdom sways in the distillations of light and plunders down into the darkness with me and comes nowhere up again, but charged into your singing, nature, when I need sing, my nature, nevermore. That whole poem, I should have done the whole thing. That whole poem will change your life, or as my students say, it will rock your world. I'd rather have it change your life. And to have written the snow poems, and to some degree garbage too, long poems at times deliberately anti-poetic, a poem not only of lists, right, or namings, but in the snow poems, a wish to discipline, indeed at times to pulverize the merely pretty. And in fact, many other poems too. Indeed, I celebrate Archie's ineludible restlessness as being Archie's fundamental truth. And that made him essential to us as young poets. In almost every other class at Cornell, we were seen as the ones who had to be taught. Those who, for all intents and purposes, had nothing to offer other than our young, unseasoned minds, which of course, in most things, was undeniable. I didn't know a thing about physics, and my grades suggested as much. Yet in Archie's seminar, we were not only taken seriously, our fledgling attempts at self-discovery, when evidenced in our poems, were celebrated, even encouraged. The class was a true workshop, non-hierarchical, unthreatening, with students who were asked to write 16 poems during the semester. There were no due dates. You had to pace yourself, over the term, which meant that you were an adult. Archie believed in our right to agency, and he would permit you to engage whatever elements that might permit you to be you. Some of this, of course, led to moments of great self-indulgence. At others, a young poet, someone who had never said a word in class, would mysteriously be struck speechful with insight. Archie did tell us that he would not read the bulk of the term's work if it were submitted at the close of term. Still, Archie would never harm a student if he or she turned the poems in late. Poets, as he once quipped, were always late. And Archie's distrust of the university and any place that to honor procedure dishonored the is disintegrative or sullied the disaffected, damn all colleges, was so much a part of his psychic DNA that he might not look like a rebel, but his mind, as we young knew, was thoroughly about invention, integration, disturbing the preconceived, disconcretizing, creating selves and worrying over them, fighting the encroaching nothingness, destabilizing the machine. None of us, at our most extreme, could match Ammons' revolutionary unpredictability or his love for our constant human revision. You hear, don't you, this is from Blair, the young man still young, still under there, saying yes, yes to the new. Unbelievable. I recall one elder who kept belittling those of us who hadn't read as widely as we should. He'd give us tests. Tell me 5 important books written between 1950 and 1955. And we'd stammer, feeling dumb and chastened. One day, Archie watched as his professor began his interrogation and walked ostensibly over to say hello. Archie smiled, shook his hand, and then very delicately, as if he were removing the skim from a pitcher of beer, asked, "Professor X, when was the last time you saw something truly miraculous? We're awed beyond your constant need to frighten and diminish." And then he quickly took us off for a cup of coffee and said, quote, I love this, "A poet a day can keep an ass away." And we were very, very happy. Before the beginning of his seminar, Professor Ammons would sit in the classroom like a penitent. He was always present before the first student tramped in. When I asked him about my own anxieties about teaching, he told me that I should always get to class before it commenced. That way, there is only one person to greet at a time, and it is not so scary. Again, Archie, who loomed as such a towering presence in our minds, was paradoxically so unnerved by us. We thought he had been holding us to our truth, to our fragility. We, unbeknownst to us, had been holding him to his. I want to provide 2 more instances where Archie, thank goodness, betrayed the myth of the adult and spoke truth, as he always did to me. When I was an undergraduate, a senior then, Archie was offered a Distinguished Poets Chair at Yale University, where he would be, rightfully so, in the company of Cleonth Brooks, Harold Bloom, and Jeffrey Hartman, people who knew his poetry well and who had rigorously championed his work. I recall that Archie took me into his office and told me about the offer, which of course was unusual, since he never talked to me about anything professional, and asked me, since he was going to New Haven for the penultimate interview, what I thought he should be mindful of, even what he might discuss with the chair. Here I'm not talking about money, which Archie knew a great deal about. He was not thinking of that. Archie, I surmise, wanted to know what I thought about these places, these true bastions of the Eastern establishment. Cornell, you must remember, to its credit, was founded on a strange congress between the practical and theoretical. It prided itself on having an agriculture college, and it was the Ivy League's city college, those of you who know the city university, with a number of first-generation students, brilliant but a bit unpolished. It was not surprising, too, that Cornell would hire Ammons, just at the outset of his career, with a bachelor's degree. Cornell, at its best, was truly a proving ground. And I may be completely wrong about this, but Archie knew that I had gone to the collegiate school, the oldest private school in America, where I was the first black. And I think on some powerful level, he believed that I knew something about these Yankees, if only how to survive them. Since I clearly was not, let us say, someone with a New England accent. I'm getting there now. But it was also a tremendous acknowledgement of his great esteem for me. An adult had never before asked me something so momentous. I remember telling Archie that I wanted what was best for him, and of course, all of us at Cornell would be distraught should he leave. But what most mattered to me was that he feel a sense of community there in New Haven, that he be valued, and I mean as the great presence he was, warts and all, that he was not only a superb poet, but for all of us, he was a champion of what poetry celebrates. Wisdom, a chance from someone from India, Harlem, or Asheville to take the heavens on and make a place not only for themselves, but for the possibilities in all of us. I told him, that is, that the currency of Yale must provide would be that of a place that understands his restlessness, that's worthy of it. I probably didn't use the word restlessness. I probably said something like, they must value your involvements. And Archie, I said, now listen how heady I was. Boy, full of myself, huh? And Archie, I said, please listen to the language of their deliberations. That places like Yale or Collegiate make a big hoopla about their affirmation of high principle and great intellectual diversity, and loving that person who, in his or her great genius, becomes the voice of us all. And yet, sadly, they often assemble merely a collection of those whom they should truly value, right? And be changed by. Which means, if you value somebody, you're changed by them, right? But the values of these institutions, sadly, take people, truly great people, and often merely collect them like trophies on a hunter's wall. Interestingly, Archie told me that when he went to Yale, he informed the chair that a friend of his worried that Yale might not fully appreciate him. And then the chair, sadly for Yale, made a capital miscalculation. The word capital is funny too. Right? When he asked Archie what poet Archie most valued, Archie quickly responded, John Ashbery, one of America's great poets and Archie's favorite living poet. Ashbery has often returned the favor, as you know, and they have a mutual admiration society. They really do. Though they don't share much in language, they do share much in their obsession with the inner life and the terrible loneliness attendant with it. We saw much of that in the poem today, in every poem. And Archie, I know, very much admired Ashbery's The Tennis Court Oath for its great restraint. And he would often read a line of Ashbery, often from Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, with a sense of glee that reminds me in its intensity of Duke Ellington's love for the mastery of his friend and fellow composer, Billy Strayhorn, if you know, man who wrote Lush Life. With little hesitation, the Yale chair immediately bellowed, "Where you admire Ashbery, we'll get Ashbery." Archie, I recall, when he remembered this encounter, looked at me with great disappointment, as if he were again in New Haven at a cattle auction, and I knew his sense of despondency. All of us who have been disenfranchised know it. You can't buy Ashbury, and you can't buy me. We're poets, not cars, trinkets, Archie told me. I hope my small advice didn't destroy one scintilla of Archie's possible literary fame. Yale does have power. For if it did, I beg the world's forgiveness. But since Archie went on to write 12 wonderful collections after Yale's misfortune, it turned out fine. And for those of us at Cornell, it was a godsend. Archie and I had our differences, but they, in hindsight, seem rather trivial, like a dusting of spring snow. It's amazing how one can get completely caught in one's self-referentiality. Archie, as you know, was quintessentially a believer that poems can be about anything, and that they should honor only one thing, truth, which means a great lyric can be about the death of someone, going to McDonald's, or the permutations of a spiderweb as an identity. There was nothing that a poem could not be, nothing, as he states in Corson's Inlet, beyond accounting. At a very dark time for me, when I was increasingly distressed about America's prospect for racial progress, I began to write political poems, hopefully not merely agitprop, but poems which took the world I lived in, or tried to live in, as their subject, and hoped, too, to re-engage Harlem. Now, in retrospect, I was too much Archie's student and had learned too much from him to write many such poems. I probably only produced 2, and they, in all actuality, were far more associative and imagistic, even pastoral, than any poems coming out of Harlem or the Black Arts movement. Still, I was excited by the new black poet's sense of authority, and though I didn't admire much of the poetry, I certainly found Imamo Baraka's best lyrics powerful, as in truth so did Archie. Interestingly, Archie had even proposed inviting Baraka, Leroy Jones, both, to teach at Cornell at least twice in my time there, which, of course, was a non-starter for a number of reasons, not least of which was Baraka's rabid anti-Semitism. It's real. Interestingly, when Ammons introduced Leroy Jones in the mid-1960s, Jones was far from generous to Ammons or his audience. When a young white student asked what a white person might do to help interracial progress, Jones said, quote, "Take that garbage can, put all your money and jewelry in it, and blow your brains out." Close quotes. Well, that was the times, rich in tooth, claw, fury, and idiocy. All of his students, incidentally, most of whom were white, applauded Jones' admonition. And yet, Archie continued to celebrate Jones, which again said much about Ammons. If you were the real thing, he'd champion you. I know that the poems in Jones' first collection, preface to a 20-volume suicide note and The Dead Lecturer, whatever their political involvements, were poems that Archie valued. The notion that, quote, "I am inside someone who hates me," Baraka's first line in Agony As Now, certainly would have resonated with Archie. How much more isolated can you be? How much more a stranger among unwelcoming forms? Thus, I, caught in my own needs, began to argue for the value of poems needing to be political. I even pushed the notion farther, suggesting that poems had to be political, a position I had to take at the time, and one that Archie, I think, realized I needed to take. But Ammons was no believer in such maxims, no matter how much they might be self-congratulatory or of value to the hurt communicant. I well recall how in class there was a young student, like all of us, who recently had been burned in a love affair and proclaimed, to our horror and joy, that no one could write a love poem anymore, that love poems were dead, mort. Archie looked tenderly at the young lady, waited a moment, and just stated, "Love poems are difficult, possibly the most difficult poems to write, largely because we are, at times luckily, able to be in love, which means just as powerfully that we will be terribly scarred when we fall out of love, since our investments are real and often so ill understood. But poetry, if you will, is the balm attendant to that scar. Love poems can be written, and even by you. And possibly you'll write the great anti-love poem, which will, ironically, be the great love poem. There are no untouchables in poetry. There are no untouchables in anything. And then he looked at her very tenderly and gave her a poem, which I wished I could have seen. And that young woman, amazingly, broke out into the most wonderful smile, and nothing more was said about it. I want to just read one Ammons love poem because we started beautiful, beautiful letters yesterday. And I want to read this for two reasons. One, because I love it, but also because this poem has become a great problem for me with my wife. Not the way you think. Because every time she asked me to read it, and then she made me provisional. I'm a provisional lover until I write a poem half as good, right? So this has gone every 5 years. I've given 5 years, right, to write a poem or something that's equal to this, right? And I just, so I've gone through that provisional status 3 times now. I'm getting a little nervous. Birthday poem for my wife. And this, of course, is for Phyllis. Have you considered how inconsequential we all are? I mean, in the long term. But anything getting closer to now, deaths, births, marriages, murders, grows the consequence till, if you kissed me, that would be a matter of great consequence. Large spaces also include us into anonymity, but you beside me, as a proximity heightens, declares myself, and you to the stars. Not a galaxy refuses its part in spelling our names. Thus you understand if you go back in the backyard or downtown to the grocery store or take a plane to Paris, time pours in around and space devours me, and like inconsequence, I'm little and lost. Oh, I love this poet, I love this poem, and he has made life very difficult for me. So Archie and I had a pregnant truce where I was wondering myself out of my despondency, but we, thank goodness, came back together. Yet probably the most important thing Archie ever did for me occurred when my brother Paul died of alcoholism in 1983. Archie wrote a very tender note on the untimely death of my brother, which of course mirrors the great loss of his own brother. It's all too unspeakable, Archie penned, and it is. When I stopped writing poems after my brother's death, I still have not written any poems since then. Many people kept telling me, I'd get back to it, or these things take time, or to heal, or you'll even be better when you return to writing. Archie, for his part, just took me aside and said, no one, not anyone, can know how you should handle this. And everything you do is the right thing. I stand with you and behind you. There are times and places where not even words should go. I love that man. When he was in his mid-60s and I was in my late 30s, he told me, Ken, I'm still 65, and I'm the same person I was when I was 15. I have the same concerns. I love the same things. I have the same insecurities. My body does not work as it did when I was 15, but it wants to, and sometimes forgets that it can't. It seems odd, as I get older, Archie's complete vulnerability becomes more and more irreplaceable. But Archie was always speaking a truth that he would not conceal. He was parting the curtains, letting me see beyond the customary blindings and self-appointed niceties that allow one to romanticize a truth. Unlike James Baldwin's parents in Sonny's Blues, those of you who know that novella, who will not discuss the looming darkness because They did not want to let the young comprehend their true terror too early. Ammons would not lie. More importantly, in each and every conversation I had with him, as long as he was not holding court, which was fun, but was not the Archie I most admired, at the end of his Cornell career, I must admit, placed Archie in a terrible quandary. He was now the famous poet, and he understandably awed many people as well they should have been. And many of these same people would ask him questions that were, in plain fact, belying their need to find a guru. And Archie had become their mark. As Ammons, when he was at his best, spoke with the elevation, lucidity, and trenchantcy of his poems, that he, like Dr. Johnson, was able to dazzle with his ability to surmise, with his epiphanies, Ammons, like Gwendolyn Brooks, spoke in the same language as his poems. One simply needed to add line breaks to Archie's conversation when he was in the throes of revelation, and voila, an Ammons poem. It was astonishing. And Ammons, too, with rare exception, seemed forever able to write. When he complained about a dry spell, it was simply that he was producing a trickle, not a torrent. And for Archie, a trickle might be take for the turn of the air. And thus many students, community members, of course, found Ammons irresistible. And his quiet generosity and omnipresent shyness, that too made him winning. He was the gentle giant, the shy gentleman, the reluctant superstar, and a man of enormous genius. He'd write poems at a prodigal rate. He'd produce 10 to 12 watercolors in a morning. He'd have produced more work, often in two distinct mediums by 8 a.m., than many people produced in a year. And if you look at the manuscripts, many of the famous poems have almost no emendations on the typescript. They came out naked and vatic, like Revelation's initial breath. Ammons, too, until very late in his life, after he had heart problems and took beta blockers, hated to read his poems publicly. He was a brilliant reader, probably the best reader of his own work. And when he read, he said little but what was necessary before the poem's introduction, saying everything with very little. He was so characteristically dead set against reading that he would never do them. He'd simply say no, which is why he is less well known than he might have been, but also that the fame he has is well earned. Readers find Ammons, and they rarely let him go. I recall an early reading by Archie at Mac Books, a local bookstore in Ithaca, which is now shuttered. The reading, one of only a handful that I recall Archie gave in his 30 years of knowing him, was set to begin at 8 p.m. Archie, always prompt, had come at 7:30 and noticed that the room, not surprisingly, was filled with admirers. And I remember that Archie approached the podium. It was 7:35 and started reading. His voice, at first so low, you could barely hear it. He had read Corson's Inlet, Coon Song, and the Ark Inside and Out before the reading was set to begin. And he finished by 8:05. Many people sadly heard just a few lines. All, of course, were mesmerized. Archie's charm, his sense that his poems seemed merely to issue from him as if he were merely a provident medium, and his inability to overthink or even acknowledge his great genius, all this was wonderful and unnerving. And Archie that day just wanted to go home. But the downside, of course, of all this fanfare is that the guru is rarely flesh and blood. Indeed, Archie never wanted groupies. The notion that you would lose your selfhood in the appreciation of his, though flattering, was truly anathema to him. It seems an odd human truism that at the moment one becomes good at something, it is often made almost impossible for him or her to pursue it. James Baldwin couldn't do another book of essays for The New Yorker 2 years before he would die, a book that would update his famous Notes of a Native Son essays, because his access to the community was compromised because he was so famous. The Harlemites didn't want to share their stories about what it meant to live on 126th Street in the, quote, heroin den, as it was then called. They wanted Baldwin to tell them about Marlon Brando and buy them drinks. Baldwin had, in effect, written himself out of his métier. Archie, however, understandably, tried to keep the sycophants away, often saying things that would disappoint them, being totally outrageous in the hope that it would undermine their preconceived notions of his sagacity. And yet Archie too welcomed the fellowship. He had been lonely for so long, that loneliness that was central to him, to his inner life, and yet as it was impossible to quench. At times Archie would literally say things, I'm certain, to see if people really could hear him anymore. Things that were so outsized and sometimes hurtful, albeit very rarely, hoping his presence would be seen, if only in provocation. If you will not see me in my goodness, then let me be seen in my devilry. Here Ammons, as all of us, was trying to be among people who would value him, and that meant at times to tell him he was wrong, that he was brilliant but misguided. But people continued to fawn over him, or more terribly, to be so completely starstruck that they were not real to Archie or he to them. It became at times a dumb show, a shadow dance, a place where need could find no suitable context, as if we had all become Jake LaMotta, puffy and self-deluded at the end of Martin Scorsese's film, Raging Bull. Archie rarely hurt people, and when he did, he would come to them, always with an abiding sense of contrition. You might be mad at him, but it did not last for long. It was a privilege to know this great poet and man, one who was always restless, but argued tenaciously for those of us who were disaffiliated, who saw us at the unwashed as wondrous, who believed that you follow truth wherever it dictated, whose mind, acts of generosity, unimpeachable conjuries, ultimate restiveness was for us the highest aim of poetry and of life, who believed in every action in the classroom that the truly exciting should be heralded, that everything is magnificent with being, and there is nothing lowly in the universe. That one should compose a love poem because it is difficult and because we can love and must. Let me end with some lines from a poem that Archie graciously dedicated to me. Improvisations from the main man, Ken McLean, which, as always, is yet a further teaching. This is actually the beginning. It's a 3-page poem. Many people have been honored by poems by Archie, but this thing has particular relevance to me. Hope it has some to you. I take no thought of and give no voice to truth. I lie not to lie by imagining I do things I don't do, or don't do things I do. I stretch, mend, piece out, leaving truth to the ineffable average of the wordless impenetrant, or where rains and springs are assimilated into lakes. Since poetry declares nothing ever, even its fantasies and lies, but the truth, I do not guide the declaration shallow, canalized into what I would hear or would have heard. If the truth is, as it is, unavoidable, it need not be pursued and cannot be fled. But there profound dissolved, it does prick your feet with thorns, but sustains you merely into your own endeavor. Truth that deep is perhaps no longer truth. I miss him terribly. The world misses him. We shall not see his like again. Thank you.